We're very delighted to introduce our today's guest speaker, Dr. Ben Marwick. Ben Marwick is an associate professor of archaeology at the University of Washington. He is the director of the interdisciplinary minor in data science and the chair of the Faculty Council on Research. His other local affiliations include the eScience Institute, the Berg Museum, the Center for Statistics and Social Sciences, the Quaternary Research Center, and the Southeast Asia Center. He also supervises the Archaeology Laboratory. His main research activities combine models from evolutionary ecology with analysis of archaeological evidence to investigate past human behavior. And today's topic is called Galisonian logic devices as affordances for decolonizing archaeology. Please, Dr. Marwick, stage is yours.
Thanks so much. And thank you so much for this invitation to this wonderful seminar series. And congratulations to you, Sultanat and Kim, for putting it all together. It's really wonderful to see such a prominent list of other speakers. I feel very honored to be in their company as well. And I'm coming to you from the University of Washington in Seattle. It's on the traditional home of the Coast Salish people, the home of the Duwamish, Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. So let me get on. Here's my outline. I'm going to review some current approaches, probably things you're all familiar with and have heard from other speakers in the series, as a starting off point to identify some opportunities that have not yet been realized in the program of decolonizing archaeology. And to do that, I'm going to investigate some of the colonial logics from literature on sort of colonialism generally, settler colonialism, not so much archaeology, kind of go back to some of the source about what is it that distinguishes a colonial system from other things, and how can we identify some of these logics in current practices of archaeological science. And then I'm going to try to connect these logics to this concept of a Galisonian logic device, which is a different sort of concept of logic here, and examine how they provide us with some affordance to undoing some of these logics. So I'm going to try to make the argument that these are where some unrealized opportunities exist for ordinary people doing normal archaeological science to contribute to decolonizing archaeology. And then finally, I will try to end with some, what I feel are fairly kind of pragmatic, concrete things that all of us should be able to take in the course of our normal work in archaeological science. Oh, I just want to, I'm looking in the chat. I don't seem to be able to share a chat message with everyone, but the slides are something that I can make available if you want to look at them. Perhaps I'll do it later because I was thinking to drop them in the chat, but I can chat them to Sultanat and then maybe you can pass them on. Here we go. In case you want to see the slides, or the comments of the slides have the sources of the illustrations and so on. Okay, so just a quick review of current approaches, things you probably are well aware of and part of your regular practice and you've heard a lot about. Demographic diversification. This was nicely expressed in a recent article by William White and Catherine Draycott, with reference especially to the UK situation. You can see a little bit of demographic information here of sort of minority groups very poorly represented in archaeology, and raising the issue that is well understood, I think, by most practitioners, that archaeology is an extremely white discipline relative to the communities in which we work and the sort of towns and cities where we live and our universities are based. We're kind of quite skewed. This plot down here on the in the lower right-hand corner, this is something quite new. Over the last summer, the Society of American Archaeology did a survey on their principles of archaeological ethics, and the society has about 7,000 members, about 1,500 replied, and I led the analysis of the survey results. And this is a multiple correspondence analysis of the demographics of the survey respondents, just to kind of reinforce this point that the discipline is not very diverse demographically, and this is an opportunity, a needful element to contribute to decolonization. And what we found in the results here is these are most of the response to the survey. This axis here is largely defined, so we have some number of demographic variables here. The y-axis here is largely defined by their ethnicity, self-identified ethnicity. Most people are falling in the kind of sort of white Caucasian ethnicity. Very few respondents to this survey, Native American or Pacific Islander, or even African American. And on this axis here, we found that what is controlling the spread along there is largely age and gender. and we have very few younger members of the discipline. So we're quite a sort of concentrated, demographically concentrated discipline, well recognized issue in archaeology that I'm sure you've heard lots about. Perhaps something a little more obscure, but still something that is prominent in the literature of decolonizing archaeology. I'm just now acknowledging a couple of the sort of current approaches that are quite prominent. This is Alison Wiley here, who was formerly a colleague here at the University of Washington, now at the University of British Columbia, I think, in just a bit further north of me, I guess. And she has presented this phrase, epistemic dynamism, and it means a kind of engagement with the knowledge systems of the communities in which many of us work, especially indigenous and descended and local ones. So she recognizes this syncretic pluralism, which is probably what most people are accustomed to practicing. It's like, okay, we go into some region to do field work that has a different culture that are resident there. And we talk to them and we listen to their stories and we acknowledge that they have stories about the past, but our stance is one of respectful toleration. I think this is kind of the status quo for most archaeologists. And these extra academic perspectives of the people that live around the sites that we work on, generally not deeply integrated into our professional scholarly narratives and our teaching and so on. This is kind of a fairly common situation, I believe. But what Alison says is necessary as part of the decolonization program is, on the other hand, not syncretic pluralism, but a dynamic pluralism, which is this active engagement, where the knowledge, the sort of traditional knowledge from community partners, indigenous stories, oral histories, and so on, her argument is that these should become part of the interpretation of the archaeological record by the scholarly archaeological scientists. So this is a far more challenging kind of way of engaging with local communities that they should be incorporated into. And there is a very nice paper in PNAS of a couple of years ago that does look at oral histories and some probability distributions of radiocarbon ages to look for things like there's an oral tradition of a plague or a population crash or something like that. Can we identify this in the radiocarbon age distributions? And sure enough, they find there's some trace of that. So there are a few examples of this kind of dynamic pluralism, but I believe it's quite rare still. And many archaeological scientists, I believe, will struggle to see a relevant way to incorporate these local knowledge systems into their own work. If you work on, isotopes or something like that, you may wonder, how can I get this story in? But this is a practice that many people who are sort of arguing for an active decolonization believe needs to become more widespread. Curriculum and citation practices, this is far more pragmatic, I think, and easier for many people to accomplish. There's a nice blog post by Colleen Morgan, who did an analysis of her own curriculum and syllabi to see, for example, what's the ratio of, in this plot here, she shows male and female authors of readings on the syllabus of the things that she asks her students to read. And further down in the post, she talks about also the ethnicity of the authors and the geographic location. And just points out that it's very geographically concentrated, in the sort of global north and west. And so there are very few authors from, Africa and South America and Asia and so on. And then, you probably have seen similar things like this. This is the Archaeological Institute of America, their first webinar, Decolonizing Syllabi. So they're recognizing as well that their teaching strategies and the documents they get their students to read are highly concentrated on, white people from wealthy nations. And so this institute is mostly classical archaeologists, working in the Mediterranean, and they've well recognized some serious issues in kind of racism present in the way they teach, because there are very few scholars outside of a certain small number of institutions that all have very similar demographic qualities. So these are fairly well kind of recognized, I think easy to appreciate elements of decolonizing practice. And I think this is the last one. One more. So repatriation, I won't say too much about it because I believe it's also another very familiar topic. In the United States here, we have federal legislation as an indicator of how kind of widely established this practice and this kind of idea is. Not that everyone agrees with it. The fact that it made it into a piece of federal legislation is kind of a profound indicator of how important it is not only for native people, for indigenous people, but also for archaeologists to realize what's necessary for an effective relationship. And this book over here, Power and the Passion, is an Australian book that was published, I think, 2012. And just last year made into a documentary film that is now kind of required. It's perhaps not required, but it's being shown in public schools, primary schools or elementary schools throughout Australia just over the last year as part of the public school curriculum on traditional Aboriginal societies. It's about repatriation and returning of ancestral remains out of museums and private collections back to traditional owners, back to Indigenous communities. In Australia, there's no equivalent of NAGPRA, but there's a strong culture amongst researchers of the importance of giving back materials that maybe were excavated some time ago, giving them back to the communities. And if it means they can't be studied ever again, that's just the cost of doing business as an archaeologist, to maintain those relationships so you can continue getting access to future scientific resources. So right, there's one. I skipped one, sorry. I have to go back to get the final one. So the final kind of common practice or much discussed issue of aspect for decolonizing scientific disciplines, and this one actually comes most prominently from a sort of soil science journal. This journal, Geoderma, last year had a special issue on this topic of helicopter research, which was a really nice set of discussions, and I believe it's quite relevant to archaeology, and I touched on it recently in a paper with some colleague from Vietnam and Myanmar on how the potential for what this concept of helicopter research can do for improving archaeological practice in Southeast Asia, where I work mostly. And so amongst the articles in this special issue of Geoderma, where they're talking about soil science and this problem of helicopter research, I've also seen it called parachute research. And you can pretty much guess what are they talking about from this, the picture here. The idea is the researcher, usually a white person from a wealthy nation, drops in out of a helicopter, grabs their samples from their poor host country and zips back to their home country and does their expensive modern scientific research, and the local community are largely ignored in the whole process, or even they're kind of exploited by being recruited to collect samples for free or for some very small compensation. So, parachute in, get the stuff and get out in a sort of military style. And so this journal recognized that in soil science, this is an issue they're not very happy with, and this has been fairly widespread. And this issue of the journal has a number of comments from researchers, for example, throughout African countries and South American countries, where they reflect on their experiences, where they've seen this kind of thing and what they want to do to prevent it, because they feel it doesn't benefit their community in any way. So I've got a little excerpt from this journal here where they talk about, this is the editors, they've extended their instructions for authors. Articles reporting primary data will normally include author's institution from the countries concerned and should include in-country ethical approval when appropriate, because they have some cases where people ducked into a country, took some samples and went back home, and that turned out they never engaged with any kind of regulatory permitting authority at all. That samples effectively illegally obtained. Same applies to Indigenous lands with Indigenous communities. So this is a very strong kind of gesture towards minimizing helicopter or parachute research, and certainly kind of disendorsing it as a way of practice. And I believe, some archaeology journals, they have similar procedures where you have to demonstrate approval in some way. And certainly many editors of many journals will strongly encourage, if you're writing in a certain region and there are no co-authors who are local to that region, they will gently nudge you and say, hey, do you have any co-authors from the region who ought to be on here? So this culture, I believe, of including authors institution from the places in which we work is kind of becoming established in archaeology. And one thing that we see many archaeology journals doing is adopting this credit system, which is a way of determining who should be a co-author and then identifying what each person has done as a co-author. In some ways, it mitigates the tensions around what's the proper order of co-authorship, because with the credit taxonomy, you can list them at the end. What did each person do according to these 14 roles? And so you can contrast this with an older system of determining authorship that many archaeologists still use from the International Council of Medical Journal Editors, and they have a 4-point system that is quite strict. You know, every author must have contributed substantially to the paper and read and approved every single word and so on. The credit taxonomy, which is increasingly being used by major publishers, doesn't require that kind of equal massive buy-in. So this one will recognize the role, for example, of people who've helped to collect, contribute samples. So things like this can help. Adopting this approach to authorship is a fairly straightforward way of kind of decolonizing archaeology by involving these people who are usually exploited by kind of more traditional colonial practices in archaeology. And we've written a little bit more about this. This is the SPAFA journal. It's a Southeast Asian archaeology journal, but we've written a little bit about this in Southeast Asia. Okay, so yeah, did that. Okay, so now I'm moving away from things that I guess are largely familiar to you and you've probably read and heard and even taught your own students about, into what I hope is somewhat more novel thinking about what are things that are colonial aspects of archaeological practice and what opportunities still remain to undo them, because obviously there's a tremendous amount of literature and thinking and talking about these other topics that I've just mentioned, but hopefully there's some new thinking here that's coming up. So I will go into some of the literature very briefly, not on archaeology specifically, but more about sort of colonial studies to identify some general logics that we then might be able to turn back to archaeology and say, where are these logics still operating? How do they dominate our system of practice? And how can we undo them? So 3 logics I just will briefly introduce from the literature, sort of colonial studies. This one is the logic of elimination. Pretty straightforward, I think. Just means like eliminate, as you can see in the title of this article. This is Patrick Wolfe, who's recognized by many as kind of introducing the distinctive concept of settler colonialism as distinct from other kinds of colonialism. And the logic of elimination is pretty much how it sounds. Just eliminate the indigenous populations, eliminate the bodies of them, eliminate their property, their knowledge systems, anything about those communities, just wipe it out. As opposed to, he contrasts this with assimilation. Instead of assimilation, the settler colonialism logic is eliminate. So this is quite a stark logic. Another one that we have, and I found this this is actually the International Journal of Historical Archaeology, so an archaeologist working here, the logic of commodification, where colonial groups, they're part of one thing that is characteristic about their activities is converting natural resources and labor resources into a commodity that they can profit from. And this is easy to imagine. The Dutch, what is it called? VOC. I can't remember the full English thing, but they go into, for example, Indonesia, and just take out things and sell them back, and then Holland becomes extremely wealthy as a result. The 3rd logic of colonial systems that I want to connect back to archaeological practice, logic of accumulation. So it's quite closely related to commodification. Just pick things up and gather them up as much as you can. This is a sort of just a characteristic behavior of colonial groups throughout recent history. So we've got these 3 logics, not particular to archaeology, just in general characteristics of how colonial systems have worked globally over the last few hundred years. Elimination, get rid of everything, take it out of circulation, make it scarce. Commodification, turn it into something of a value that can be profited from, and then accumulate, just sort of build these things up into a massive surplus that can be traded and from which value can be extracted. So let's see. I'll try to make an argument now to extend back from this kind of theory of colonial systems and their logics into contemporary archaeological practice to see what opportunities remain for new types of decolonizing behavior. And so the way I want to do that is with this now somewhat dated claim of data being the new oil. And this came from a talk by, I think, largely an ad man, not an archaeologist or anyone really in our field, but making the claim that sensors and the internet and the ability to collect very large amounts of data, this is the new kind of resource that we can exploit and sell and refine, and we can do so many things with it. It's not just that it's available in great abundance now, but it's that you can process it into so many other products and sell them off as gasoline and plastic and nylon and all kinds of other derivative things. And so I'm going to talk about how now archaeological data can be kind of like an oil, in the same way that oil was one of these commodities that motivated many colonial groups to occupy indigenous lands and exploit, and became one of these things that they eliminated indigenous groups to acquire, and then commodified to sell and refine, and accumulated in massive tanks to then put, sort of control the market of. So is archaeological data have some of the properties that we can connect to colonial practices. So a nice book here, New Dark Age by James Brindle, that helps, I think, to make some of this connection between data and oil and the sort of how colonial systems can sort of allow us to identify ways that they're used and ways in which we can change the use. So he talks about data also having an imperialist and colonialist history and tied to capitalist networks, and a particularly nice connection here between the information superhighway to the internet and networks of telegraph cables that were often colonial projects, as part of communicating with different settlements. He talks about the idea of exploitation, exploiting the indigenous people and their reserves, exploiting people's private data is something we're well familiar with over the last few years, and Cambridge Analytica and so on. So he talks further about how gathering, acquiring, and controlling data sustains and nourishes unequal power relationships. And I think this is a really critical point for us that I will expand on in a second, about colonial logics have at their root like unequal power relationships, and so does the collection and distribution of research data, and especially for archaeologists. Perhaps for archaeologists, just no more than as well as any other field, I believe. And then I've got a few things over the text in the bottom here. I can't quite read it. Something that's forcibly extracted. So data and oil have this thing in common: we're often extracted under conditions that may be unethical, perhaps, even if not at the time they were. Certainly now we often face the challenge as archaeologists where we have many alluring data sets that are collected under conditions that we kind of cringe at and feel a bit uncomfortable about, and maybe we're not sure if we should be working on those because of the conditions under which they were connected. So the real nexus, I think, of this data as the new oil argument between archaeology and colonial systems, I find in this blog post by Andrei Kostopoulos, who's an archaeologist up in Canada, just north of me. And he makes this argument about the prestige economy of archaeology being controlled, being determined by how people behave around archaeological data. And he makes the point that it's basically bad for archaeology. So I'll just highlight a couple of his observations here. He's talking about how archaeology, the organization of archaeology appeals to the sin of, has the sin of the appeal to authority. So we often say like, well, let's ask that person, they know that area, they've worked in the region for a long time, they're the kind of authority on the region. Because they get this authority as the keepers of the knowledge, right? They've read all the literature, presumably, and they've perhaps excavated many sites, seen many artifacts. They have this very kind of personal experience of the data, which gives them this authority, which we then recognize by asking them to review the grants, review the manuscripts, or we give them many prestigious appointments and invitations based on their authority that comes from the knowledge. So, and from there, they give this prestige. And if those people are required to share that information and data that they've acquired through their personal activity and experience, this is a threat to their prestige. If other people can have access to the same kinds of information, then they no longer are the sort of sole repository and keeper of that knowledge, and their access to prestigious opportunities, to named professorships and so on diminishes, and they will sense a threat to that. And so this is why Andrei Kostopoulos says that many archaeologists, the natural instinct is to kind of hoard data and be very reluctant to share it out and to sort of resist practices that make data sets available because they sense that as a potential threat to their prestige and their sort of career progress and stability. And so these people's status becomes devalued if the knowledge on which their status is based becomes then widely disseminated. and easily available. So his main point is we have a prestige economy of knowledge in archaeology that kind of structures the discipline in very powerful ways. You know, the senior important archaeologists that we respect and value, a lot of that comes from their, not partially their sort of intellectual power and experience, but also the fact they have a lot of data kind of at their fingertips, maybe in a drawer, in a computer file somewhere, that perhaps they're not maybe not willing to share, or just not sharing because it may diminish their prestige in some way. So he says this leads to long-term data protectionism. So let me now try to link this observation about prestige economy and knowledge and data in archaeology that Andre makes back to these three logics of colonial systems that I just have mentioned. So just go to the next slide. Okay, so here we go. All right, so I talked about elimination, commodification, and accumulation. And so here's my linkage here. See what you think if this makes sense. So you know, in the colonial literature, they talk about elimination. In Andre's post, you know, we talk about people hoarding data. So we have the sense of elimination in eliminating the data out of circulation so other people can't use it. A student cannot use it to study. Another researcher couldn't use it for synthesis or comparison, for example. The data are effectively being eliminated from circulation, eliminated from the community by being put in someone's drawer or their computer file, where you could only access them if you have a certain kind of relationship with that person. You are their student or you're their collaborator or something like that. Very personal connection. Commodification, I think this is pretty straightforward, where the data are routinely exchanged for prestige. You know, I will give you my review of this grant. You know, if you sort of admit me to the reviewers panel, or you know, if you want expertise on, you know, slavery in the Caribbean, you'd need to hire me into that position because I'm the only one who sort of has the access to those data sets. So we can convert data into prestige, which then gets translated into very practical things that make a difference to how well we can pay our rent and buy food and so on. And finally, the third logic, accumulation. The same idea, the longer that you work in some region and accumulate more data, and of course you will publish some prestigious papers, but you may not publish the data behind the papers that allow other people to do related work, the more you can accumulate prestige and the kind of baubles that come along with that, prestigious appointments and grants and more publications and a large sort of stable of graduate students and postdocs. So I think we can make a case for these colonial logics, elimination, commodification, and accumulation, being things that structure the way archaeologists interact with data currently, and thus reveal kind of opportunities for decolonizing archaeological practice that have not yet been thoroughly explored in the way some of the others have. So now what I want to do is introduce how do Galisonian logic devices help us to realize some of these opportunities. So let's just take a look. All right, so what are they? So he talks, this is Peter Galison here. He's a philosopher of science, I think currently at Harvard. He has this book, Image and Logic, which is a fun read about history of sort of micro particle physics. And he makes this distinction in his book, in the history of physics, between the image tradition and the logic tradition. And so this is the logic tradition is now what I'm talking about when I say Galisonian logic device. I'm talking about the devices that Peter Galison recognizes in the logic tradition. And in his history of microparticle physics, he sort of talks about this early image tradition. And they start off, this is Ben Nevis, a mountain in Scotland, where people literally went up into this observatory into a cloud and sort of sat up in clouds and watched things happen inside, you know, normal clouds that form in the sky. And so they sort of perceived the phenomenon of the weather and kind of particles moving through the atmosphere directly as an image directly on their eye. And then a major breakthrough was made when they invented this bubble chamber in the 1950s. Charles Wilson, I think, working in Cambridge actually, and they could create clouds in this chamber, which was fantastic because that meant they didn't have to go climb up into the observatory anymore. They could create these sort of simulate these weather systems in these glass bubbles and observe things happening in there. But all of this is very dependent on direct observations with the naked eye and making illustrations and observations directly from those illustrations. And what Galison says, he says, you know, okay, so you have Kuhn and the paradigm shift and this idea that sets of ideas get swept away by new sets of ideas that are completely incompatible with the old ones, like the Earth at the center of the universe and the sun at the center of the universe, he says. Peter Galisson says, no, it's not so much about this paradigm, it's more about the tools that people are using drives kind of revolutions in thinking. And he makes the interesting contrast in physics between image-based tools, where people are looking directly at things, and logic-based tools, where it's more like instrumental detection and counting, and not so much dependent on sort of the native eye. So I just have here's an image here, for example, at the peak of the image tradition. When sort of atom smashes at fairly large sizes, they would take photographs of things that happened in those chambers. And then these people, who are nearly all women, who were known as the computer. So this is a time, in the 50s, when a computer was a job description rather than an actual device. And they would look at projections of these photographs and just make observations directly of the photograph and make measurements of those. So this is why he calls it the image tradition. It's very much based on a person creating an image and then measuring and interpreting directly off the image. And so the next major breakthrough, according to Galisson, the logic tradition, is where the image largely becomes secondary to the process of kind of analysis. We get these now very massive devices for accelerating particles at tremendous energies. These are both at Berkeley and the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, high energy devices. And instead, these kind of things that, instead of someone taking a photograph of the particles rushing around inside, they're using like sensors, electronic sensors that generate an output, like a table of numbers and so on. And still you can produce an image, an illustration for a paper, but it's largely generated through a completely different process, through a sort of mechanical, electromechanical process. He says, the logic gates of a microprocessor, for example, are kind of the dominant thing that's going on in these image tradition. And so I think what are the equivalents of these in archaeology that might point us to some opportunities for undoing or mitigating these three colonial logics that we've just discussed. And so the image tradition, just for some simple examples about how we can start to think about this is Flinders Petrie, some Egyptian pots, his kind of typological sort of seriation type of diagram there. These are the ages that he thinks they go in there. It's very much just looking at the pot and shuffling them around until they go into what seems like a good sort of seriation. And down the bottom here, this is an illustration from Francois Borde and his Neolithic Mysterian typology. And the same idea, I think, look at the artifact, get a feel. Is this the kind of point that could have killed the bear? There's a very particular kind of Mysterian type that is apparently distinctive because that's the one that they thought could kill a bear or not. And it's very much based on the image, right? Creating an image and sort of organizing images and then communicating by images. And then what you probably are already guessing, in archaeology especially, this is Willard Libby in the 50s and 60s, and he's invented or, helped to make radiocarbon dating widespread. And so that kind of gives us this is a logic tradition for determining the age of things. It's very much instrumental and kind of output by counting things by instrumentation. And then down here, this is a similar approach. These are stone artifacts. These ones are from Easter Island. These are the so-called spear points, which Carl Lipo and his colleagues showed were completely not spear points at all, kind of busting the ecocide myth of Jared Diamond and showing that they're more like agricultural or sort of ritual tools for scarification and tattooing and stuff. And they have taken the image of the artifact and used a geometric morphometry to do some statistical analysis of the shape. So we see a couple of examples here of the logic tradition where, instrumentation, computation, calculation has kind of become a mediator of the archaeological data. And I believe this approach, this logic tradition, wherever we can see it in archaeology or indeed any discipline, gives us some substantial affordances for decolonizing. So it makes it kind of a natural, easy way that seems obvious, given the technique that we're using, compared to the image. So the image tradition, these are more like, we often think of an image, these are very carefully handcrafted, like an artwork. They don't have the same, an artwork doesn't have the same affordances, I believe. I will try to make the case in the next few minutes. These artworks don't really have the affordances for decolonizing in terms of making available and sharing. Artworks are things that are typically accumulated, eliminated into private collections, like if we're lucky they go into a gallery, and concentrated by wealthy people. And you generally don't email someone and say, could you send me your beautiful illustration of pots? It's not just a thing that is unusual in any discipline. But if you have an output from an instrument, they're often arrive to us in a digital form that's very amenable to circulation by electronic means and sharing and sort of synthesis and so on. Okay, so I'll spend a few minutes now trying to convince you that Galisonian logic devices, where we can identify their use in archaeology, and I believe it's pretty widespread, probably most of you are using something that we could argue is a Galisonian logic device rather than an image device. How do they provide affordances to undoing these colonial logics of elimination, accumulation, and commodification? So just to put us all on a similar grasp of what it is an affordance, there are a couple of different definitions. And so I've kind of summarized two of them here. Possibilities for action. So possibilities for action. So things that might be possible given a certain object or the environment in which an organism or an object is situated in. The second definition is slightly different. Perceived and actual properties that give cues to an object's operation. So this is very common in human-centered design, human-computer interaction studies. So for example, this illustration here, like if you see a switch that looks like this, if you're faced with a wall, you want to turn the lights and you see something like this, the design of the switch kind of invites you to poke your finger at it. And then similarly, this one, the affordance of the switch is to flick it up and down, and this one is to rotate. So these come from this book, James Gibson and a couple of other people working on this. So it's kind of like, given a certain object or environment, what are the things that seem like the logical or natural ways that this thing or object should be, what we should do with it, right? So let's consider if we can focus on these sort of Galisonian logic devices, the things that output, a digital file, a tabular structure of data, what affordances do they kind of have? What possibilities are available given their nature? And so people who work in these fields, this sort of human-centered design and so on, human-centered interaction, they often have this kind of taxonomy of affordances about what kind of actions are possible. Is there an action possible? Can you turn on the light or not? And can another person see that? Can they perceive it? So they would say if the action is possible, but no one can see it, then they call it a hidden affordance. And if the action is possible and it's both perceived, then there's a perceived affordance. This is obviously the most desirable state here. So let me try to link this sense of affordances and this taxonomy to the concept of the logic device to sort of make it clear about where are these unrealized opportunities in archaeological science. So I will sort of sketch out this idea that the action that we're most interested in here is mitigating these logics of elimination, commodification, and accumulation, especially of archaeological data. That's the focus that I really want to stick to here. So how can we stop or reduce these behaviors around archaeological data? And what are these? So, and I would say that in the logic tradition, if we are doing archaeological science that involves the logic tradition, some kind of instrumental work, anything, many kinds of laboratory science now like this, like an isotope or DNA analysis, many kinds of geoarchaeology, then you're in the zone of a possibility for action, I would say. The instrument you're using generates data that has the affordance of being easy to share. It's so easy to deposit this in a repository or to email it or to attach it as a supplementary file to your publication, right? It's usually small enough. The structure is usually very convenient for other people to use and make sense of. So therefore, the potential for use and the action possibility, I would say, is yes. In the image tradition, on the other hand, if your work is more based on hand-drawn illustrations, to use one example of the image tradition, action possibilities are somewhat limited there because of this kind of culture and mindset around those objects as kind of artworks that are your property and your sort of thing that are not really suitable for other people to mass circulate or mass reproduce, because we generally are not thinking about that in terms of our kind of beautiful field and data illustrations that are done by hand or by an artist or something like that. So I put them in the area of no action or limited action. And so let me now extend this argument a bit further. If our action is to mitigate these colonial logics, and then we identify where the action possibilities are, and we're in the logic tradition, how is it perceived by, for example, authors of a journal article? And how can we sort of concretely recognize, like, where on this taxonomy of affordances is a certain piece of work, for example. Well, how well is it recognizing the decolonizing potential of working in the logic tradition of archaeological science? And so the ideal place is up here in the upper right, in my opinion. In the logic tradition, you have the action possibility of making the data available, and if you're using code to analyze the data, such as the R programming language or Python or anything that is similarly convenient to share, available to share in open source, you are both, you've realized the possibility for action for undoing these qualities, these colonial logics in the use of archaeological data. And you've also as a scientist, you've perceived that possibility and you've kind of done it. So this, I believe, is a kind of ideal state. You've worked in a way that enables sharing of your materials to prevent these three logics, and you've made it clear to other people that that's a thing that you are doing and they can benefit from that. And so let's just briefly look at some of the other things, the less desirable things, I guess, from my point of view, where if you write in your paper, and I just saw a paper this morning that looked quite nice and does exactly this, falls squarely in this box here. They mentioned that they use R, this particular paper I'm talking about from this morning, use R, but they don't share that at all. It's not available to the reader in any fashion. So I would say we can recognize the possibility for action for this decolonizing potential. They could be contributing to elimination, to the mitigation of elimination, quantification, accumulation. We can see it because they tell us about it, but the authors themselves haven't perceived this and haven't actually followed through by doing it. Another sort of taxonomic possibility in the taxonomy here, where perhaps working in the image tradition, there's some kind of data, we don't know what form it is in, what affordance it has, but they recognize there's some possibility recognized by the author to that it could be useful for someone else, that they could contribute to eliminating, removing the concept of elimination, commodification, accumulation, but they haven't really followed through with the action of doing so because it's just not openly available to us most of the time. And some of you may do this routinely, write this sentence in your paper, and you may be different to the average archaeologist. Most archaeologists, most scholars do not share when people do make a request because they don't recognize the author, or they feel for various reasons it's not a good thing for them to do. So this is kind of the Murphy's share, we would say in Australia, when it means you're going to do something, but you don't do it. And finally, down here, this is the nothing kind of quadrant. No mention of are we in what is the potential, what is the action possibility, and there's no evidence of whether or not the authors have perceived anything. So this is how I'm linking the Galisonian logic device and the affordances that they offer to the kind of actions that we're interested in here to give kind of decolonizing potential, especially with regard to how archaeologists behave around their data sets. So I will just now give a little bit of, I guess, a sort of ethnographic kind of analysis of contemporary archaeological scientists, and you probably will recognize yourself, perhaps as a data point in what I'm about to show, just to help us identify like where are parts of the community, what parts of the community are very active in, taking advantage of these affordances and maybe unknowingly even decolonizing archaeology, and where are parts of the discipline that are kind of still, let's say, in the dark, yet to take advantage of the affordances offered by this kind of Galisonian logic approach. Let's have a look. So this is from a paper that I published with Sophie Schmidt last year, Tool-Driven Revolutions in Archaeological Science, where we really embrace Peter Gallison's kind of analysis and his framework and look deeply into bibliometric data in archaeology. And we look at some 40,000 journal articles. And here what we see as a proxy for working in to mitigate, these logics of accumulation, commodification, and the third one has just left me, it doesn't matter. We look at the citation, where's the pointer? We look at articles, we divide them into two groups that cite the R programming language just as a convenient proxy for people who are working in a way that has the potential to share their code, share their data. Other people can easily access this kind of analysis. Now, if the code is available, it would be reproducible for other people, highly likely. We can contrast these articles that cite R, for example, with articles that use some kind of point and click software where the trace of the analysis, the workflow of the analysis is largely obscure. You know, the pointing and clicking, once it's done, you often cannot recover what it is. So these give that, you know, there's high action potential in there. What we've done is looked at these are the words in the titles of these 40,000 articles. And so up here, for example, in this quadrant of the graph, these words here are ones that are highly associated with archaeological journal articles that cite R as their kind of analytical tool. And ones over in this quadrant, you know, in this side of this red line, these are highly associated with articles that do not cite R, right? So let's take a quick look. Articles that tend to cite R often have the word lithic in their title. Lithic, data, experimental, spatial, and isotope appears 2 times, this synonym isotope and isotopic. Radiocarbon dating, and I know from, you know, reading some of the articles on which these come from, you know, we read hundreds of these to find out it definitely is the case that there are really a lot of people working on radiocarbon dating, especially, you know, hundreds to thousands of radiocarbon ages. Enrico Kramer, your colleague, is a pioneer in this field, and several others. And they're very much, you know, taking advantage of the affordances that these Galisonian logic devices and our package, our software, I will argue, is a logic device, and they share all of their code that generates all of the data, all the results of their papers. Many people working on stone artifacts and isotope analysis are doing this as well. You know, their publications often accompanied by actual code that generates the results. What else have we got? People work on human skeletal remains. In terms of time periods, Pleistocene and Paleolithic is down here. You can see China, France, Africa in terms of geographic regions. So these are what we would call, you know, people who are, you know, archaeological scientists at the forefront of, you know, doing decolonizing archaeological science, using tools that afford undoing these colonial logics. And not all of these papers are doing that, but I have a subset of papers that I will show you in a second that are definitely doing this in a very amazing and impressive way. So let's look at the sad end of the triangle down here, the sad quadrant or half. And we've got, let's see, metal, pottery, ceramic. I'll just move a zoom toolbar here. Ceramics again. So pottery and people working on ceramics, ritual, rock. There's also dating here, landscape. But I think definitely we can see ceramic. If you are a person who's studying ceramics, you have an opportunity to be a pioneer in your community by taking on some of the affordances that logic devices allow to decolonize the practice of archaeological ceramics. We can see there's not much going on there in terms of, you know, in terms of this kind of rough proxy of doing work that can contribute to decolonization. Just a final data point on this bibliometric study before I move on to the last section of a couple of very concrete points, concrete sort of things we can all do. This is from a list that I keep with other colleagues, and I know some of you have contributed to this as well. It's on a website here. It's just a list of journal articles in archaeology, where not only does the author cite the use of the R programming language, but they also make available the full code and data set to reproduce all of the figures and tables in their article. And so I feel this is like a fantastic list of really gold standard archaeological science, which is, you know, optimum levels of the most desirable levels of transparency and reproducibility, which, as you know, is the cornerstone really of any kind of scientific practice. And just to point out that this has increased greatly. So since I started paying attention to this around 2011, huge step up between 2017 and 18. And now I just updated this yesterday. This came from the paper, the same paper I mentioned with Sophie Schmidt, and the data were, I didn't include last year's data in that paper because it was published at the beginning of last year, but yesterday I updated it. And so now we can see the data from this year just passed, of course, you know, the largest year yet. But what I want to point out just before moving on, this current year, you know, we are in the second month of the year, and already we have nearly half the number of papers published that have adopted this practice, which I argue is a decolonizing practice, of making available the full code and data publicly available. You don't have to request it, it's just there. The authors make it available as a supplement on a repository. Already this year, we have seen a large number of papers, half as many as last year. So, you know, I'm very optimistic that by the end of this year, we will see a great number. And so it's a sort of trend that I believe is emerging. And I think it's prudent for us to be aware of this, because it may be the case that student journals shortly will require this behavior. And so it's prudent for us to adopt it before we have forced to, I believe. Okay, to conclude, a couple of concrete sort of suggestions about how to connect these three logics, colonial logics, these Galisonian logic devices, the observations of Andrei Kostopoulos, for example, to our own kind of day-to-day practice. What can we do to participate in this kind of decolonizing, these novel frontiers of decolonizing archaeology? So, plan for our research data to be fair. And many of you will have no choice because, for example, the European Horizon 2020 project, all funding received by that requires it. And briefly, what does it mean? You know, someone can find your data on, say, in the supplementary or in the repository. It's accessible. And the key point here is that it has a DOI. That's a great sort of proxy shortcut. If you've got a DOI for your data set, there's a pretty good chance it's going to be highly accessible. Interoperable, so these are the acronym, you know, FAIR. And then the nice way to see that is it's in a format. You make the data available in a format that other people can easily use. So, you know, this XZQ file, a very exotic file format, best not to use those for data files because probably no one can use them. And reusable refers to licenses. It's a big topic I won't talk about anymore today because of the scope. And just to visualize further of the complexity here, for most archaeologists, this FAIR business is pretty straightforward. But if you work in large projects that work with local government data and so on, there's some complexity about all of this that is quite well explored and documented. There's a lot of guidance on this from other disciplines as well. But FAIR is not the only concept especially for archaeologists, that we should consider. We also have this sort of set of concepts called CARE, which especially relates to working with indigenous communities and their data. And I think for archaeologists, we can extend it to any community that we work with that are not part of the scholarly community. And so I won't go into this in detail, except to say, when collecting, using, and sharing the data, consider these CARE principles: who benefits, and conversely, who would get harmed from your decisions about the data, who has the authority around their data. So, you know, indigenous communities should have authority. We should recognize that, and they should have some say in how the data is used and shared. And sort of corresponding to that, you know, we have some responsibility. Indigenous communities have a responsibility to make decisions about data as well, and we need to include them into that in meaningful ways. And sometimes this means not sharing data at all, and I will talk about that just briefly in a second. And the E is for, you know, ethical concern, minimizing harm in how do we collect, use, and share data. And often for archaeologists, this seems irrelevant. But when you consider things like locations of archaeological sites, if we share the locations of those, they can put the sites at risk for vandalism and so on. So FAIR and CARE are two of these kind of guiding acronyms that we can use very concretely in our own work. So just a little bit more guidance on, you know, how to decide what do we do, when to share, when to not. There are definitely reasons not to share, and I've tried to organize a simple taxonomy, and there's lots of literature, and I've put some of these into the comments of this slide. You know, obvious things, perhaps by now to me obvious, about why would you share. Good reasons to share increase the also sort of career advantages to that. This is an alternative pathway to prestige. The old prestige economy, this is the new prestige economy, I would say. And also, you know, there's a communitarian benefit. You can make it possible for other people to learn from your work, because they can access things that perhaps they don't have access to an instructor who can give them access to the data. They can access your data from your publications. But reasons not to share. So these are genuine reasons why you would not want to share something. And people would say, where's your data? And you say, well, I couldn't share it for one of these reasons. You don't have permission from the groups that you're working with. They could put some things at risk. Locations, cultural information of people's personal privacy. Here are reasons that that are bad reasons not to share, right? So you say, well, people are going to misunderstand my data, they will misuse it. And I believe this is because you are too lazy to contextualize appropriately, right? I think it's rarely the case that archaeologists are going to have a bona fide reason to fear misuse of the data. You know, people who work on like autism and maybe even immunization data, like maybe they have a more serious risk of malicious people badly using their data. I think in archaeology, the risk of that for us is extremely small, and I believe we can overcome it most of the time with proper effort into contextualization. You know, like Stonehenge. What about the data from Stonehenge? We can release that, contextualize it properly to mitigate people talking about aliens and Phoenicians and whatever else. Fear of things that might damage our traditional prestige economy status, getting scooped, we can't publish our Nature paper, we don't get enough citations. I believe these are not good reasons and should be mitigated. It can be managed with techniques that are available to us and tools. And fear of irreproducible results and shame. Well, this is a valid fear, but I think you should be taking care that your work is reproducible before you make it public in any way, and it's not good scientific practice to have this fear, to let this fear stop you from sharing your data. Bad reasons to share, I haven't come up with any yet. Maybe you can suggest me some. And I will just finish off with a couple more concrete observations. These affordances kind of connect to an ecosystem of openness that is developing in archaeology and pretty well established, and also in several other like cognate disciplines, ecology, political science, economics, and so on. And I just present here some of the toolkit that many archaeologists are using to take advantage of these affordances. And I mentioned data, these are some repositories where you can put data for other people to access that give you the DOI. I've mentioned R and Python. This is Git for version control. I haven't talked much about open access. I know probably many of you are very familiar with this already because there's been a lot of national and federal and European Union legislation about this. But just want to point out Peer Community in Archaeology, which is a very interesting publication project that gives open peer review to preprints. And so do check that out. They're doing a wonderful job of, it's all free, of course. So often when you think of open access, you think, oh, I have to pay a whopping APC. And these projects here they're completely free to the user. They're sort of institutionally sponsored. So part of a toolkit. And we recognize this toolkit and this ecosystem as allowing us to work on a spectrum of reproducibility. And I have kind of cheekily, provocatively called advertising this end here, which is the kind of the status quo in archaeology. You publish a paper, you got some figures, you got some tables, but all of the goodies really, the raw data and maybe the code, if you used to analyze it, they live on your computer and no one else can see them unless you're a student or you're a close colleague. So this is the status quo. And really what you're doing in publishing a paper is advertising. You're just showing someone that you got some analysis. Here's the result. Maybe it's right. Maybe it's reliable. You just hope the reader has faith in you. But what I believe we should be thinking about moving towards is archaeological science, where the text of the paper and then the code and the data that generate the figures and the text are available to the reader without having to request them. And they're all linked together and licensed in a way that permits reuse for synthesis and teaching and so on. So I called this in the past reproducibility spectrum, because you can be at 0, most archaeologists are, or you can be at 100, and the 187 odd papers that I just showed briefly, they're the ones that are mostly up at 100. And I recognize, of course, that it's not always possible. As I said, there are good reasons not to share data. Sometimes you'll be at 50%, and that will be just fine. That will be the best effort you can do. And people should recognize that that is an excellent, an excellent contribution to the discipline. But being at 0, I think there really is no excuse for anyone to be at 0 at the moment. And what I'd like to do now is just update this diagram and say, okay, we can recognize this as a reproducibility spectrum, and we should all be striving, if we want to identify as an archaeological scientist, to be at 100%. But we can also identify this diagram as a decolonization spectrum as well, because many of the tools and practices around increasing reproducibility are affordances for decolonizing archaeology by diminishing this kind of the logics of elimination, accumulation, and commodification. So second to last slide, implications. And so if you happen to be a student, or if you are an instructor, or have some role in curriculum design and so on, I believe you have some implications. There are some implications of this way of thinking about decolonizing archaeology and the potential, this unrealized potential, especially around practices with data and method. And so here's the implications sort of sketched out in a diagram here. This is our kind of traditional education system. And if you are an instructor, you will recognize it. And perhaps if you're a PhD student near the end of your PhD, you may see it as well. You have a wide breadth of knowledge on a fairly small, you know a wide variety of topics, but just to a small amount. You may be able to speak for a few minutes on Viking buttons or something like that. But really, you could speak for a long time on a sort of very narrow topic certain isotope measurements from teeth of some people in the Mediterranean or something like that. So the domain specialty is what we spend most of our time teaching to graduate students and encouraging them to focus on. But of course, we like them to have some breadth of a wide variety of topics, but we expect them to basically be this T-shaped researcher where you plunge deeply into a certain field. But I think if we recognize this kind of argument about colonizing logic, colonizers' logics and Galisonian logic devices and so on, and the affordances, we need to consider what I'm calling the gamma-shaped researcher, where your skill set and your practice includes skills on reproducibility and computing to take advantage of these affordances provided by logic devices. So that means if you are an instructor, you need to make sure your students have these skills before they enter the professional community. And if you're a practitioner, you need to be acquiring and demonstrating these skills as well. Okay, last slide. Here it is. So I think I'll just stop. I won't repeat these points because I've spoken for a little bit longer than I thought. So thank you so much. I hope I will share the slides via link and open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marwick, for absolutely fascinating talk. We have about 13 minutes for Q&A session. Just please raise your hand and I will invite you to ask your question. Question? Yes, Nathan, please.
Thanks for the great talk, Dr. Marwick. I was wondering, this was kind of a question I had more towards the earlier part of your presentation, but I was wondering what you thought about what responsibility do we have as archaeologists for kind of making up for the past data exploitation of communities?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Yeah, great question. So I think it must be, yeah, so a complicated question. I know many scholars struggling with this currently, legacy collections and how do we return them? And what if the community from which they came don't care about them anymore? They're not happy with, they don't have the interest in dealing with them. I think it must be, we must develop a relationship with the relevant traditional people and then sort of negotiate what makes the most sense for them. Are they interested in repatriation, or do they have, is their connection with them now so remote they don't care? In any case, the first step must be some sort of establishment of a relationship and negotiation from there. And I don't think we can prescribe much beyond that. It's just negotiation. And then if the community want repatriation, then that's what you do. And if they are interested in some research going on, then do that. So yeah, difficult to prescribe anything beyond negotiation, I would say. Yeah, tough question. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Marcus.
Sorry. Hi, and thank you, Ben. That was a great talk, really enjoyable and informative and persuasive. And I also like, I suppose, the optimistic outlook of it. There's some way to go, but at least, there's a change, hopefully, in the right direction. And so, I'm sure all of us here find ourselves agreeing with you, of course, and thinking that we could do better, and you're giving us pointers as to where to go. But I wonder whether I could ask you to maybe share some thoughts, if you have any, on another dimension of this that certainly concerns me and for which I don't have a straightforward solution. Now, when we use Galisonian logic devices or analytical instruments that produce data, yes, they make it easier for us to, in principle, share the data, share the algorithms and codes that we use to turn our signals into data, and we certainly should. But my concern is always that at the same time, we are applying colonial logics to the access to the resources and the knowledge. So we are still the ones selecting the samples. We are still the ones with access to specialized knowledge and indeed to the material resources, to the instruments. So we can share the data, we can share the code, but we are applying the bottleneck somewhere else where we are still very strongly colonial. And of course, it's not an easy one. And so we can think about, and that is very prone to science helicoptering or parachuting, where we analyze our stuff and then we share our isotopic data or our chemical analysis, but we're still very much operating in a very colonial framework, which arguably is harder. It's easier to resolve if we're just looking at images where anyone can potentially arguably have a go at interpreting that image. But so we are black boxing our science, and we are sometimes just washing our hands off by saying, here's my data, here's my code, but we're still the ones ruling, deciding what gets analyzed, how it gets analyzed, the kinds of data we generate, etc. And I wonder if you have some thoughts about how we go about these other paradigms.
Yeah. Yes, very fair point. And, definitely my whole concept here is definitely the low-hanging fruit, the easiest things that I think any person can normally do in their normal course of their research as a small contribution to decolonizing. And you're quite right in identifying the far more challenging and profound transformations elsewhere that I haven't really talked about. I think, they relate to things like the demographic diversity of the discipline, like including in the research communities, scholars from those communities. Like in my case, I work in Southeast Asia. I need to see more Southeast Asian scholars who are getting PhDs and doing this kind of work and working in labs. And perhaps I think the greatest challenge, so this is in the sort of review of concepts that I believe are fairly well established, perhaps less widely practiced because of the challenge they pose. It's difficult to find people who are ready to come into a Western PhD program from, say, a Southeast Asian undergraduate program, in my experience. And then the epistemic pluralism that Alison Wiley argues for, that's a super difficult idea for many archaeologists because, we're trained to think about the past in a certain way. And then Alison Wiley says, now you need to connect that into an indigenous oral tradition, which to most Western ears coming out of a Western university education just sounds ridiculous. A lot of the narratives in oral tradition just are completely incoherent and inconsistent with any, they just don't fit at all. And so I think you've correctly identified like the far greater challenges in decolonizing. Firstly, the demographic diversity, like bringing people into the discipline that historically are not well represented, and finding sort of pathways for them to come in. And then this kind of epistemic pluralism, and this is really challenging, I think, for especially, and many of you like me sort of raised in like where evolutionary theory is kind of a motivating body of ideas, and oral tradition and indigenous theory often quite sort of opposite to that. And so that's, yeah, you correctly identified, I think, the far greater challenges, and I freely admit to sort of passing them on to smarter and better people, Alison Wiley and other people, and really trying to, as you say, take an optimistic approach that here's an easy thing, I think, for most people that will make a difference. And maybe, my sort of hope is like thinking about the concept of helicopter research. Like if we do archaeological science, we go into the country or the region that we work, we might spend a couple of extra days of our field work, at the local university, for example, maybe give a short workshop on the data sets that we've collected and worked on, and just work through with the students and faculty there, like how do we make sense of this so that they can, improve their understanding of these kind of the colonial logics that go into the analysis, and then, gives them a stronger footing for participating, for example, as co-authors. And we might, we're all committed to long-term relationships, right? And we might go there 1 year, talk to a bunch of undergraduates, and then 5 years later, one of those undergraduates might be ready to go into a graduate program, which will then give them this sort of skills to participate as a peer, and co-author and maybe lead their own projects. And so if we imagine kind of a long game with undoing this helicopter concept, eventually perhaps we can have people participating in a way that's, sort of overcomes some of these problems with the lack of demographic diversity and epistemic pluralism. Someone who is brought up in these local traditions has a much better chance of integrating them with sort of Western scientific discourse than we do, I think, for whom these local traditions are totally exotic and foreign, and we have bring in a lot of implicit biases. So good point. Well taken that you identify these far more challenging parts that I've largely handed off to better archaeologists. But I think let's say, for example, you are the editor-in-chief of a journal, for example, you may consider, a concrete implementation of these things might be to consider nominating a member of your editorial board who might take on the specific duty. They might have this sort of narrowly defined role as a kind of data or reproducibility editor to check that the submissions that come in from anywhere in the world to this journal are consistent with the journal's data policy, for example. Because we often see journals have these ambitious data policies, the article must have all the data available and so on, but no one really has the time or the energy or has the awareness to know what to look for. And I see some journals, for example, in statistics and political science, they've appointed a special role on the editorial board, and their sole job is to just do that checking, just to check over the manuscripts and make sure the authors have honored that policy. And I think that's another kind of low-hanging fruit that many of us, that work with journals can accomplish. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
We still have time for one more question. Does someone have a question? No, then if no, then thank you very much, Dr. Marwick, for absolutely fascinating talk. And the next seminar will not be, so we will skip next seminar. So hope to see you in a week, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.